had died before the humans arrived, and that number would grow because the toxins were still in the ecosystem, and the damage would take years to heal. But 7.8 billion Velothi were still alive, and the humans were fighting for every single one of them. Human doctors worked in conditions that most galactic medical professionals would have refused to enter, wearing protective gear that was not quite good enough, because human equipment was designed for human environments, and Shalur 4 was a water world with different chemistry. And the medics adapted and improvised and kept working. Human engineers were rebuilding atmospheric scrubbers and water purification systems, and they were doing it with a speed that baffled the Velothi, because humans had an almost supernatural ability to look at a broken thing and figure out how to make it work again, a skill that came from living on a world where things broke constantly, and you either fixed them or you died. And human Marines stood guard around the refugee camps and the hospitals and the evacuation zones, not because there was any immediate threat, but because the Velothi were afraid, and the presence of these strange, powerful beings who had come to fight for them made them feel safe. 6 cycles after the battle, the Galactic Cooperative finally arrived, a diplomatic fleet of 200 ships carrying humanitarian supplies and medical equipment, and a very large number of bureaucrats dropped out of faster-than-light travel near Shalur 4 and found a scene that did not match their expectations. They had expected to find a dead world or a dying one, and instead they found human ships in orbit, and human hospitals on the ground, and human engineers rebuilding infrastructure, and human soldiers keeping the peace. The cooperative response was complicated. Relief that the Velothi had been saved, mixed with shock at the scale of it all. What humanity had done, mixed with a deep and uncomfortable fear at what it meant that humanity could do this at all. The emergency session of the Cooperative Council was held aboard the diplomatic flagship, and it was not a calm meeting. This was an act of war conducted without authorization, the Telluri representative declared, their feathered crest rigid with indignation. Humanity deployed military forces in cooperative space without permission and without consultation, and this is a direct violation of the Charter. They boarded and captured sovereign vessels, the Kolani delegate added, a heavy-bodied species whose voice rumbled like distant thunder. The legal implications alone will take decades to resolve. They used antimatter weapons, another voice called out, weapons we have attempted to restrict for centuries. Ambassador Jonah Achebe sat in his seat and listened to all of it, with the same gentle, patient expression he always wore. Chamber had exhausted its outrage. He stood. Everything you have said is correct, he began, and his voice was soft, and the chamber went quiet to hear him. We acted without authority, and we used weapons you find distasteful, and we violated protocols that have governed this body for thousands of years. And while we did all of those things, 1.2 billion Velothi died, waiting for this council to finish debating whether they deserved to be saved. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of a pause in conversation, but the sharp, terrible silence of a truth that no one wanted to hear. Let me tell you what we found when we arrived, Achebe continued. We found cities melting, and oceans boiling, and children dying in their parents' arms. And we found that the greatest alliance in galactic history had done nothing, and was planning to continue doing nothing for several more cycles, while it discussed the finer points of jurisdictional authority. He looked around the chamber, and met the eyes of every representative who would hold his gaze. Humanity created the Death World fleets because we studied your response times, and we found them to be a death sentence for any species unlucky enough to need help quickly. And we decided that we would not allow that to happen, because we know what it is like to suffer, and we know what it is like to wait for help that never comes. We did not ask your permission, because your permission would have arrived too late, and we will not apologize for saving 7.8 billion lives. If that makes us criminals in the eyes of this council, then we accept that judgment. He sat down. The chamber was still. Then Elder Shumara stood. She was attending the session as a representative of the Vialathi people, and she was still weak from the toxin exposure, and her translucent skin was pale and mottled with the marks of chemical burns. Straight, and her voice carried. "I activated the refuge protocol," she said. "I begged the galaxy for help, and the galaxy debated, and the humans came, and they bled for us, and they died for us, and they carried our children out of poison with their bare hands." Her voice shook, but she did not stop. 4,214 of them are dead because they chose to save people they had never met. And you sit here and talk about protocol, and I say to you that protocol is a cold thing to hold when your world is burning. She looked at Achebe, and then at the Cooperative Council. Let the record show that when the Vialathi called for help, humanity answered, and no one else did. She sat down, and the chamber remained silent for a long time. In the days that followed, something shifted in the galaxy. Not a loud dramatic change, but a quiet deep one, like the movement of tectonic plates far below the surface. 12 smaller species, the ones who lived on the edges of cooperative space, where threats were real and response times were longest, opened diplomatic channels with Earth. They did not announce it publicly, and they did not discuss it in council sessions, but they reached out quietly and carefully and asked the same question in a dozen different languages. "Will you come for us too if we call?" And humanity answered the same way every time. "We will come for you, whether you call or not." On Shalur 4, Captain Ose visited a temporary hospital in what remained of the city of Thaleen. She walked through the wards filled with injured Vialathi, and she stopped by each bed, and she did not speak, because she did not know their language well enough for the things she wanted to say. She stopped at a small bed where a Vialathi child lay recovering from toxin exposure, and the child looked up at her with large dark eyes and reached out a small translucent hand. The child flinched at first, because human skin was rough and warm, and so different from anything the child had ever touched. Then, the child held on tighter. Ose sat down beside the bed and stayed until the child fell asleep. And she did not let go of that small hand, because this was why they fought, and this was why they bled, and this was why 4,214 of her people had given everything. Not for territory, and not for power, and not for glory, for this, for a child who was afraid, and who needed someone to hold on to. 6 months passed, and the galaxy tried to go back to normal, but normal had a crack in it now. And the crack was shaped like 40 human warships that had torn through 300 hive ships, like wolves through a flock of sleeping birds. The Kraith remnant had fled to the galactic rim, that cold, empty stretch of space, where the stars thinned out, and the darkness between them grew wide and hungry. And for 6 months they had been quiet, and the galaxy had allowed itself to hope that quiet meant gone. The galaxy was wrong. The transmission came on every frequency, a broad-spectrum scream that hit every listening station from the core worlds to the outer territories, and it carried the chemical signal language of the Kraith hive intelligence, translated into galactic standard by automated systems that did not understand that some messages were better left untranslated. "We name the species of the third world of the yellow star, and we name them enemy, and we name them prey, and we will find their world, and we will consume it, and we will consume every world that sheltered them, and every world that thanked them, and we will not stop until there is nothing left of them but dust and memory." On 4,000 worlds, the reaction was terror. On Earth, the reaction was something else entirely. Admiral Cale Drennan watched the transmission in his office aboard Unity Station, and when it was finished, he turned it off and sat quietly for a moment, and then he called a meeting. Not a defensive meeting, and not a strategic review, and not a committee to discuss options and assess risk. A hunting meeting. "They have told us where they are," Drennan said to the assembled fleet commanders, whose faces filled the holographic display around him. "They are on the rim, and they are rebuilding, and they have made it very clear that they intend to come for us and for every species that we protected. So we are not going to wait for Captain Mira Osei, now commanding the newly rebuilt Perseverance II, a ship that carried the name of its predecessor like a scar worn with pride, leaned forward in her display frame. "Rules of engagement?" she asked. "Find them and end them," Drennan said, and there was no anger in his voice, and no hatred, only the calm, steady resolve of a man who understood that some threats could not be negotiated with, and some predators could not be reasoned with, and the only way to protect the people you loved was to make sure the danger never reached them. We do not wait for them to pick their next target, and we do not wait for another refuge call, and we do not wait for another 1.2 billion people to die while we track their movements, and we go now, and we finish this. On Earth, the Kraith transmission played on every news network, and in every home, and in every school, and the people watched it, and they were not afraid. They were angry. Blind anger that makes people stupid, but the cold, deep anger that makes people dangerous. The kind of anger that comes from knowing that someone has threatened not just you, but every innocent life you swore to protect. Recruitment centers for the Deathworld fleet saw lines that stretched around city blocks, and the people who stood in those lines were not soldiers by nature. They were teachers, and engineers, and doctors, and farmers, and artists who had decided that they would rather fight than watch someone else suffer. This was what the galaxy did not understand about humanity, and what the Kraith had fatally failed to understand. Threatening humans did not make them submit, and it did not make them cower, and it did not make them negotiate. It made them come for you. On Nexus Prime, the Cooperative formally censured humanity for its actions at Shallur 4, and the vote was unanimous, and the resolution was strongly worded, and it meant absolutely nothing. Hours after the public censure vote, in a classified closed session that would never appear in any official record, the Cooperative Council Chair invited Ambassador Achebe to a private meeting. The room was small and plain, and there were no cameras and no recorders, and the Council Chair, an ancient Pelori whose bark-like skin was gray with age, looked at Achebe with eyes that held something Achebe had never seen in them before. It was not anger, and it was not resentment. It was need. "The Kraith are not the only threat in this galaxy," the Council Chair said quietly. "There are others, and some of them are worse, and we have known about them for centuries, and we have never had the ability to do anything about them." The old Pelori leaned forward. "Can you protect us from what else is out there?" Achebe looked at the Council Chair for a long moment, and in that moment, the entire relationship between humanity and the galaxy shifted on its axis. "Already are," Achebe said. "You just did not know." The Council Chair stared at him. "The Deathworld fleets," Achebe continued. "You thought there were 7 of them, because 7 is what we allowed you to detect, and the truth is that there are 23 battle groups spread across the galaxy, running silent in the spaces between stars, watching everything. We have been the galaxy's self-appointed guardians for a decade, and in that time, we have intercepted 4 threats that you never knew about, and neutralized 2 hostile incursions that would have reached cooperative space within years, and we did all of it without telling you, because we knew you would try to stop us, and we could not allow that." The Council Chair was silent for a very long time. "You arrogant, terrifying, magnificent creatures," the Pelori whispered. "We prefer the term concerned neighbors," Achebe said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, he smiled. The Battle of Shallur 4. The Perseverance II was on patrol in the Outer Territories, with a mixed crew that now included officers from 12 different species who had volunteered for joint operations postings with the human fleet. Among them was a young Vialathi communications officer named Tail, who was Shu'Umara's daughter, the same child who had been carried out of the poison on Shallur 4, now grown enough to serve and determined to stand beside the people who had saved her world. She found Captain Osei on the observation deck one evening, standing alone in the dark, looking out at the stars, with an expression that was not quite sadness, and not quite peace, but something in between. "Captain," Tail said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you do it?" the young Velothi asked, and her translucent skin flickered with the soft blue of genuine curiosity. "How do you always run toward the danger, when every instinct should tell you to run away?" Osei was quiet for a moment, and the stars turned slowly outside the viewport, and the ship hummed around them, with the sound of 40,000 tons of metal and purpose, moving through the void. "Because we remember what it is like when no one comes," she said. Tail thought about that, and she thought about the day the sky turned black over Thelene, and she thought about her mother's arms around her, and the sound of human dropships cutting through poison clouds, and the rough, warm hand of a soldier pulling them to safety. "I think I understand," she said quietly. "I hope you never have to," Osei replied. Then the communications panel chimed, and Tail moved to her station and listened, and her skin went pale. "Captain," she said, "we are receiving a refuge call from the Samathi system on the far side of the galaxy, and there is a colony of 3 billion under attack by an unknown hostile force." Osei did not hesitate, and she did not pause, did not convene a meeting to discuss options. "Set course for the Samathi system maximum speed," she said. "Signal the fleet, we are moving now." The Perseverance, too, turned toward the screaming and began to run, and behind her the rest of the fleet followed. And in the dark between the stars, 22 other battle groups adjusted their positions, like a vast, invisible net, closing around every threatened world in the galaxy. Tail watched Captain Osei standing on the bridge, steady and certain, and burning with a purpose that was older than starships and older than civilization, a purpose that went all the way back to the first human who heard a cry for help in the dark and chose to answer it. The galaxy had called humanity monsters and deathworlders and barbarians and reckless and dangerous, and they had been right about all of it. But they had missed the most important thing. The monsters were on your side, and they were already hunting. The Kraith Hive intelligence felt the human ships before it saw them. A cluster of small, fast signatures burning toward Shallower 4 with an urgency that was unusual for the prey species of this galaxy. It calculated threat levels the way it always did, by measuring mass and numbers and energy output. And it concluded that 40 small vessels against 312 hive ships was not a battle, but an inconvenience. The hive intelligence had consumed 114 worlds across 3,000 years, and it had never encountered anything that could stop it, and it had no reason to believe this would be different. It was wrong. Captain Mira Osei stood on the bridge of the Perseverance and watched the countdown timer hit 0. And then she gave the order that would make the Kraith understand what a death world really was. All ships drop inside the formation and engage at point-blank range. Every tactical doctrine in the galaxy said that you engaged a superior force from maximum distance, where your speed and maneuverability could keep you alive. Humans did not follow galactic tactical doctrine. Humans followed the doctrine of wolves, which said that you do not circle the herd from a safe distance, but instead you crash into the middle of it, and you bite, and you tear, and you create chaos, because chaos favors the bold and the violent, and the ones who are not afraid to bleed. 40 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the Kraith formation, appearing between hive ships like sparks in a dark room, so close that the Kraith vessels could not bring their main weapons to bear without hitting each other. The first volley was kinetic rounds, massive slugs of tungsten and depleted uranium fired from electromagnetic railguns that could punch holes through mountains on high-gravity worlds. They struck the nearest hive ships like hammer blows, and the living chitin hulls cracked and split, and the bioluminescent glow flickered and died in the areas around the impact points. The Kraith hive intelligence reacted with confusion, because this was not how prey behaved, and then it reacted with anger and turned its harvesting beams toward the human ships. The beams hit the Perseverance, and the hull screamed and alarms blared across every deck. But the ship held, because human engineers built their vessels the same way their planet had built them, tough and dense and capable of taking punishment that would tear anything else apart. Hull integrity at 87%, the damage control officer reported. Fire Hellfire torpedoes, full spread, Osei commanded. The Hellfire torpedoes were a human invention that the cooperative had tried to ban 3 times because they were considered excessively destructive. They were antimatter warheads, originally designed to crack open bunkers on worlds with gravity 3 times Earth standard, dense targets buried under kilometers of rock and metal, and now they were aimed at hive ships that had never been designed to withstand anything, because nothing had ever fought back. The first torpedo hit a hive ship amidships, and the explosion was silent in the vacuum of space. But on the bridge of the Perseverance, the sensors showed a blossom of white light that briefly outshone the local star. When the light faded, the hive ship was in 2 pieces, both halves venting atmosphere and biological material into space like blood from a severed artery. "Target destroyed," Shen reported, and his voice was steady because this was what they had trained for. "Next target," Osei said. Across the formation, the other human ships were doing the same thing, each one picking a hive ship and hammering it with everything they had, while dancing between the larger vessels, with an agility that the Kraeth could not match. But the kinetic rounds and the torpedoes were not the worst thing the humans brought. The worst thing was the Marines. On 12 of the 40 human ships, boarding shuttles launched from armored bays and burned hard toward the nearest hive ships, carrying teams of soldiers in powered exoskeleton suits that made each one of them as strong as a small vehicle and as durable as a tank. The shuttles hit the hive ship hulls, and breaching charges blew through the chitin, and the Marines poured inside. Sergeant First Class Diego Vargas was the first human to set foot inside a living Kraeth hive ship, and the first thing he noticed was the smell. Thick and organic and warm, like the inside of something alive, which is exactly what it was. The corridors were not corridors in any way he understood, but rather tunnels of pulsing flesh, lit by bioluminescent nodes that cast everything in a sickly green light. "Neural core should be 200 meters forward and down," his technical specialist reported through the squad channel. "Move," Vargas said, and his squad moved. The Kraeth drones came for them in waves, insectoid creatures, each one nearly 2 meters tall, with razor-sharp limbs and mandibles that could cut through standard galactic hull plating. They could not cut through human-powered armor. Vargas fired his automatic shotgun into the first wave, and the tungsten flechettes shredded chitin and flesh, and the drones fell, and more came behind them, and he kept firing, and his squad kept firing, and they pushed forward step by step through the nightmare corridors of the hive ship. The drones were fast, and they were strong, and on any other species they would have been overwhelming. But the humans had grown up on a world where everything was fast and strong and trying to kill you, and they had spent their entire evolutionary history learning one simple lesson: do not stop moving forward. Vargas and his squad reached the neural core in 11 minutes, and they planted charges, and they blew it. Hive ship shuddered and went dark around them like a giant animal dying. Across the battle, 12 hive ships went dark from boarding actions, and dozens more were crippled or destroyed by torpedo and railgun fire. And the Kraeth hive intelligence was experiencing something it had no framework to process. For 3,000 years, it had been the predator, and it had consumed and grown and spread, and nothing in the galaxy had ever made it feel what it was feeling now. It was being hunted inside its own ships by creatures that were smaller and fewer, and should have been prey, but were not prey, and had never been prey, and carried with them a ferocity that burned like acid through the hive intelligence's calculations. The word for what the hive intelligence felt did not exist in its own chemical language. In human language, the word was fear. On the surface of Shallua 4, the skies were choked with toxic clouds from the Crayth harvesting beams, and the oceans were poisoned, and millions of Vialathi were dying in their cities and in the waters they had called home for 10,000 years. Elder Shuumara sat in a shelter beneath the city of Thelene, holding her daughter and waiting to die, because there was nothing else to do, and no one was coming. Then she heard the sound. It was a roar that cut through the toxic clouds, deep and powerful, and she looked up through the shelter's viewport and saw shapes descending through the poisoned sky. Human dropships, blunt and ugly and armored like the fist of an angry god, punching through atmosphere that would have dissolved the ships of most galactic species. They landed hard on the flooding streets of Thelene, and their ramps dropped, and humans came out wearing breathing equipment and carrying medical supplies and rescue gear. And they moved fast through the toxic air that was burning their exposed skin where the seals were not perfect. And they did not stop. "Shelters and get everyone to the ships," a human officer shouted through a translator unit. "Move, move, move." Shuumara watched a human soldier pick up a Vialathi child who had collapsed in the flooded street and carry the child in arms that were thick and strong and impossibly warm. And the soldier did not slow down and did not hesitate, and the toxic air was visibly irritating the skin around his eyes, but he kept moving. She had called for help, and the galaxy had debated. These strange, dense, terrifying creatures from a world that wanted to kill them had answered. Shuumara held her daughter tighter and stumbled toward the dropships, and the human soldier at the ramp reached out a rough, calloused hand and pulled them both inside, and the air in the ship was clean and warm. "You are safe now," the soldier said through the translator, and his voice was gentle in a way that did not match his scarred hands and hard eyes. Above them in orbit, the battle raged on. The Crayth were breaking and running, and the wolves of Earth were not finished hunting. Captain Mira Osei stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Perseverance and watched the stars stretch and blur as her ship tore through space at speeds that would have made most galactic engineers faint. She was a woman built like the world that made her, compact and dense and strong in ways that had nothing to do with size, with dark skin and close-cropped hair and eyes that never seemed to blink when something important was happening. Around her, the bridge crew moved with the kind of quiet focus that came from years of training, and the deep, unspoken understanding that every second they wasted was a second someone on Shallua 4 spent dying. "Fleet status," she said. "All 40 ships in formation and burning hard," her executive officer, Commander Chen, reported from the tactical station. "Estimated arrival in 16 hours, and we are running hot on the reactor, but she will hold." Osei nodded and looked at the tactical display, where 312 red contacts glowed like embers against the dark backdrop of space. Markers swarmed around the blue dot that was Shallua 4 like flies on a wound. 40 against 312. She had seen worse odds in the simulations, and she had seen worse odds in reality. And she was not afraid, because fear was something humans had learned to carry like a tool rather than a chain. Far across the galaxy, on a very different kind of ship, in a bright and comfortable lecture hall aboard a cooperative academic vessel, Professor Tolek was trying to explain this exact concept to a room full of students who could not understand it. Tolek was a Mirali, a species that resembled tall, thin beings made of something like living glass, elegant and fragile and brilliant in ways that humans found genuinely impressive. He had spent 30 years studying humanity, and he was still not sure he understood them, and he was completely sure they terrified him. "Today we discuss the species classified as Homo sapiens," he said to his students, voice carrying the harmonic resonance that all Mirali used when speaking. "Commonly known as humans, and commonly misunderstood by everyone in this room, including myself." He activated a holographic display that showed a rotating image of Earth, and several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats because even the image of that world felt hostile. Earth, Tolek said, Class 12 Death World, and I want you to understand what that classification means, because most of you have grown up on worlds rated between Class 1 and Class 4, where the most dangerous thing in your environment was perhaps a steep hill. Earth has active tectonic plates that cause massive ground-shaking events that can level cities in seconds, and it has volcanic eruptions that can block out the sun for years. And it has rotating columns of wind that can pick up structures and throw them kilometers. And it has waves of water taller than buildings that can erase coastlines. And it has extreme temperature, ranges that go from hot enough to cook flesh to cold enough to freeze blood solid. The students were pale now, or whatever color their species turned when they were horrified. And that is just the planet itself, Tolek continued. The life forms are worse, because everything on Earth is trying to kill everything else, and has been doing so for billions of years, and humans evolved right in the middle of all of it. He showed images of Earth predators, and parasites, and venomous creatures, and the students made sounds of distress that Tolek had learned to expect. Their gravity is 1g, which is nearly double the galactic average, and this means their bones are dense and their muscles are thick, and they can take physical punishment that would shatter most of our bodies, and they can keep functioning with injuries that would put any of us into permanent shock. But the most important thing, and here Tolek paused because this was the part that kept him awake at night, the most important thing is what all of this did to their minds. Humans are persistence predators, and this means they evolved to chase prey over long distances, not by being the fastest, but by simply never stopping and outlasting everything they hunted until it collapsed from exhaustion. They experience fear just like we do, but where we freeze or flee, they have developed the ability to feel fear and then choose to act anyway. I want you to sit with that concept for a moment, because it is the single most terrifying thing about them. They do not lack fear, and they are not broken, and they are not malfunctioning. They feel every bit of the terror that you or I would feel in a dangerous situation, and then they move forward anyway, because something in their evolution decided that the creatures who ran toward the danger were the ones who survived. Back on the Perseverance, Captain Osei was reviewing the Kraith tactical data in her ready room with her senior officers. Their ships are big and they are tough, but they are designed for harvesting, not for combat against an equal force, she said, pointing at the weak points her intelligence team had identified. They have never fought anyone who hit back hard, and they have certainly never fought anyone insane enough to board them. Commander Chen raised an eyebrow. Boarding actions against ships that are essentially living organisms filled with thousands of hostile drones. Yes, Osei said simply. The Marines are going to love that, Chen said, and he was not being sarcastic, because he knew the Marines, and he knew that they genuinely would love that, because they were humans, and humans were exactly the kind of species that heard the words impossible suicide mission and interpreted them as an interesting challenge. On Nexus Prime, the Cooperative Council had been debating for 9 hours. They had formed 3 subcommittees and commissioned 2 risk assessments, called for a vote on whether to call for a vote on military intervention. Ambassador Jonah Achibi sat in humanity's seat in the great circular chamber and watched the proceedings with the patience of a man who had expected exactly this, and had planned for exactly this. He was a slim man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, and he wore simple clothes, and he spoke softly, and every diplomat in the chamber had learned the hard way that underestimating him was a serious mistake. When the council chair called for yet another procedural review, Achibi stood. Honored representatives, he said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. I wish to inform this council that the United Earth Naval Command has dispatched Deathworld Fleet 7 to Shalur 4, and they will arrive in approximately 7 hours. The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped in a dozen languages, and translators struggled to keep up. Resonance chimed again and again, trying to restore order. "You had no authority," the Telleri representative shouted, their feathered crest flaring with outrage. "You are correct," HFY said calmly. "We had no authority, and we also had no time, and neither do the 9 billion people currently being consumed on Shalur 4, while this council discusses procedure." "This is a violation of the cooperative charter," another representative called out. "Yes, it is," HFY agreed with a small nod, "and when this is over you may censure us, and you may sanction us, and you may write very strongly worded letters about our conduct. And we will accept all of it, because we would rather be punished for acting than be forgiven for doing nothing." The chamber went quiet. HFY transmitted a data package to every console in the room, showing the real-time position of Fleet 7, 40 bright points of light, burning through the void toward Shalur 4. "In 7 hours," he repeated, "your deliberations may continue at whatever pace you find comfortable." Then he sat down. In the back of the chamber, a Vialathi diplomatic aide who had been listening, with her hands pressed over her mouth, lowered them slowly. And for the first time since the refuge call went out, she felt something other than despair. She did not have a word for it in her own language. The closest translation in human language was hope. The signal came screaming across every open frequency in the galaxy, like a wound that would not close. It started on Shalur 4, a water world covered in vast blue oceans and floating cities made of coral and living stone, where 9 billion Vialathi lived their quiet lives beneath 3 pale moons. The Vialathi were not fighters, and they had never been fighters, and they had never wanted to be fighters, because their bodies were soft and translucent and made for swimming through warm currents, not for war and not for violence, and not for the terrible things that were now falling from their sky. The Kraith came without warning. Their hive ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, like a dark stain spreading across the stars, 312 vessels each 1 kilometer long, and covered in a living shell of black chitin that pulsed with a sickly bioluminescent glow. The Kraith were harvesters, and that was the polite word for what they did. The truth was much worse than harvesting, and the truth was that they consumed entire worlds, and stripped them down to bare rock, and used the biological matter of every living thing to feed their ships, and grow their fleets, and birth more soldiers into their endless hungry swarm. The Vialathi had no weapons, and they had no shields worth mentioning, and they had no fleet, because they had always believed the Galactic Cooperative would protect them. That was the promise, after all. 4,000 species united under one banner, sworn to mutual defense, sworn to answer when one of their own called for help. So the Vialathi ambassador, a trembling elder named Shu Umara, whose translucent skin flickered with the deep violet of absolute terror, sat before a communications array in the capital city of Thaleen, and activated the Refuge Protocol. The Refuge Protocol was ancient, and it was sacred, and it had only been used twice in 11,000 years of recorded galactic history. Both times the response had come too late. Shuamara pressed her 3-fingered hand against the activation panel, and spoke the words that would be heard by every listening station in the cooperative. "We are 9 billion, and we cannot fight, and we cannot run, and we beg you please come for us before there is nothing left to save." The signal raced outward at speeds that bent the laws of physics, carried on subspace frequencies that could cross the entire galaxy in hours, and it hit every diplomatic channel and every military listening post and every government office on every member world of the cooperative. And on 4,000 worlds, the response was almost exactly the same. Committees were formed, and meetings were scheduled, and debates began about jurisdiction and military readiness and legal authority and who would pay for fuel costs and whether the Kraith technically qualified as an existential threat under Section 7 of the Mutual Defense Charter, or merely a severe regional disruption under Section 12. on the elegant crystal towers of the Cooperative Council headquarters, on Nexus Prime. Representatives argued about procedure, while 9 billion people waited to die. This was how the galaxy worked, and it had always been how the galaxy worked, because most species in the Cooperative had evolved on gentle worlds, with mild climates and low gravity, where the biggest predator was something the size of a house cat, and the worst natural disaster was a light rain. They had never learned urgency, because they had never needed it. But the signal also reached a small, unremarkable system near the Orion Spur, a system that most galactic navigational charts marked with a warning label that read, Class 12 Death World, approach with extreme caution. The system was called Sol, and the third planet from its star was called Earth, and the beings who lived on it were called humans. Admiral Cale Drennan received the refuge call in his office aboard the orbital command station Unity, a massive ring of metal and purpose that circled Earth like a crown of iron. He was a tall man with gray hair cut short, and eyes the color of a winter sky, and hands that had signed too many letters to too many families who had lost someone under his command. He listened to the Valafi signal once, and then he listened to it again, and then he turned to his aide, a young lieutenant named Patel, who was already pulling up star charts on the holographic display. How long? Drennan asked. Deathworld Fleet 7 is running silent in the Kasara Drift, Patel said, her fingers moving fast across the controls. If they burn hard, they can reach Shalur 4 in 17 hours and 40 minutes. Drennan nodded once, a small, sharp movement, like the click of a loaded weapon. Signal Captain Osei, and tell her to take the fleet in hot, and tell her the Kraef committed to their target just like we. Patel looked up from her console, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite surprise, because she had served under Drennan long enough to